Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and a presentation that takes a look at the causes of the crises in Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1956 and 1968 respectively. Now there will be a lot of important detail left out. I'm afraid that these presentations just don't allow for that level of detail. But I will present, at least I think so, a very useful analysis for you. And if you wish, you can get all the detail you'll need in my ebook, Containment, that you can find on Amazon. Now, in looking at causes, there are always long-term and short-term factors to think about. But I think a better way to look at long-term factors is to think of them as fundamental or underlying factors. And short-term factors, well, I would look at them as triggers. With that in mind, in both countries, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the fundamental or underlying factors would focus on the fact that the Soviet Union had imposed foreign rule and a communist ideology on them. Hungary was one of the countries with little support for communism or for the Soviet Union. It was a strongly Catholic country, and it had allied with Germany in the war. But the communists gained power using the secret police to discredit other parties and persecute non-communist politicians, whilst the party rigged elections. So it was that a communist government was headed by Matyas Rákosi, who had spent World War II in the Soviet Union and was very much in the Stalinist mould. Opposition politicians were imprisoned, and there were show trials, executions, and labour camps. The government controlled the press. There was no freedom of speech, and the secret police continued to ply their trade. The church was seen as subversive and was persecuted. Cardinal Mindszenty had been imprisoned. By 1956, some 200,000 Hungarians had been arrested and imprisoned without just cause, and approximately 2,000 of those had been executed. However, Stalin had died in 1953, and Khrushchev denounced Stalin in his secret speech and introduced a program of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union, as well as calling for peaceful coexistence between the communist bloc and America and the West, meaning they should learn to live with one another rather than be forever competing with each other. It seemed like a new dawn. A more fundamental cause to the crisis in Hungary, though, was the poor standard of living of the Hungarian people, which was dropping alarmingly. Food shortages were blamed on the collective farms, which had been forced on Hungary, whilst workers were poorly paid. Meanwhile, many of the best goods that were made in Hungary went to the Soviet Union. And all the time, Hungary felt like an occupied state. There were thousands of Soviet military and officials in the country, which Hungary had to pay for, adding insult upon insult. And in some areas of the country, there were even Russian schools and shops, and some street names were written in Russian. The Catholic schools had been nationalized, and children were obliged to learn communist history as well as the Russian language. In June 1956, Rákosi lost power. He appealed to Moscow for help, but the Kremlin ordered him to be retired for health reasons. His replacement, though, Erno Gero was also extremely unpopular. In October, there was a large anti-Soviet demonstration when a state funeral was belatedly held for Laszlo Rajk, the former foreign minister executed for criticising the government, with somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Hungarians taking to the streets. This was the trigger. Protests reached a climax near the end of October, with a massive student demonstration supported by workers, which demanded free speech, a free press and free elections. Police fired into the crowd and the demonstration turned into a riot. The giant statue of Stalin in Budapest was pulled down and taken through the streets on the back of a cart. Secret police and communist leaders were lynched. The Soviet Union was obliged to accept a government headed by Imre Nagy. Nagy's government, which included non-communists, made plans for free elections, meaning an end to the one-party state, the introduction of Western-style civil rights, ending repression, ending censorship, and ensuring a free press and the creation of impartial courts. Economic change would begin with the restoration of private farmland. The government called for the complete withdrawal of Soviet troops and planned to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact and position Hungary as a neutral country as far as the Cold War was concerned. Hungary was breaking away. It was too much for the Soviet Union to allow. The Czech crisis unfolded much later, and this is an important point. After World War II, Czechoslovakia had felt betrayed by the West at Munich and had been invaded by Nazi Germany, whilst communists had been active in the underground movement during the Nazi occupation. And unlike in other countries in Eastern Europe, Soviet troops withdrew after the war. Consequently, Czechoslovakia was a country which had some support for communism, and the Czech president Edvard Beneš was prepared to cooperate with Stalin. This helps explain why the Czechs didn't protest until later. At first, there was a communist-led coalition government in Czechoslovakia, though communists gradually took control of key ministries, and when in 1947 non-communist ministers in the government resigned, Czechoslovakia very quickly became a single-party state and was brought firmly into the Soviet bloc. In 1948, the hardline Stalinist Klement Gottwald took over as president and remained in control until his death in 1953, the same year as Stalin died. And so we come to the underlying factors that help explain the crisis of 1968. But another thing of significance in 1968 is that in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, weakened by the Cuban Missile Crisis, had been eased out of power in 1964 and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was firmly opposed to any change to the status quo. He was determined to prevent such civil liberties as freedom of expression, at home as well as across the Soviet bloc, and he expected the countries of the bloc to display complete subservience and loyalty to Moscow. But the Czechs hadn't enjoyed the experience of Soviet-directed communist government, and by the 1960s they wanted their economy to be freed from Soviet control. Czech farms had been collectivized and farmers had been told what to grow. As for industry, instead of producing what the Soviet Union demanded of them, they wanted it to produce consumer goods, and they wanted to trade with the West more. They wanted a better standard of living. The Czechs were demanding a more democratic system of government too, and more civil rights. They wanted to be able to set up alternative parties to the Communist Party and to be able to vote freely in elections. They wanted the restrictions on trade unions removed. They wanted better working conditions and more pay. Czechs also wanted an end to the way in which the secret police control their lives. They wanted a free press and a free radio. They also wanted to be free to travel abroad. And Slovaks, who had fared even worse than the Czechs, demanded equality. It was a long and weighty set of demands. The old hardline Stalinist Czech president, Antonin Novotny, was having none of it though. He could see the Czech economy was in trouble, but he was determined to maintain the command economy. As a result, wages and living standards continued to fall. Novotny increased censorship, arrested more dissidents, and to no one's surprise, became more unpopular. There were demonstrations, at first led by students, in most of Czechoslovakia's main cities. And here we have the Czech trigger. At the beginning of 1968, Novotny was forced out. He was replaced by Alexander Dubček, who sought to introduce reforms to the system. But sensitive to what had happened in Hungary, he was eager to emphasize that Czechoslovakia would remain socialist and would remain in the Warsaw Pact as well as Comecon. What he proposed was socialism with a human face, which meant an easing of censorship, more freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, free trade unions, and a reduced role for the secret police. Other political parties would be permitted, and political prisoners would be freed. There was a proposal to form an alternative party, the Social Democratic Party, and elections for a new National Assembly would be held. Czech businesses would not be tied to the Soviet Union's command economy, and Czechs would also be free to travel outside of the Soviet bloc, and Slovaks would be given greater equality. But as censorship was eased, so opposition voices, opposition to the communists, were raised. This blossoming of freedom came to be known as the Prague Spring. Demands grew, this time from within the Soviet bloc, for the Soviet Union to do something. So, there you are. I hope it was a useful analysis for you. Don't forget you can find more detail in my containment book on Amazon, or my compilation of all the Cold War topics. And I will follow this presentation up soon with the Soviet Union's reaction to the two crises, as well as a brief comparison between the two. But now, my job is to thank you for listening. Good luck with your studies, whatever stage you are at as you watch this presentation. Cheers.